Hello.
Ishan.
Hi. I'm not able to see anyone.
Why you're not audible?
Hey, Ishan.
Hello. You can't hear me? Anyone?
I can hear.
Okay. Cool. Let me just start my screen sharing, just in case.
Yeah.
I'll have to join in again because it's asking for permissions for screen sharing. I'll join in
Just
again.
a minute.
Sure.
I think Pallavi, you can give, I think, permission, right? Or
No. It's my system. My computer is asking for permissions. I need to start again.
okay.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, yes, Ishan.
Okay, cool. All right. And you can see it in full screen mode right now.
Yes.
Cool.
It's quite early for you, right?
Yeah, it's I got up at 6 today.
Okay.
It's 7 a.m.
And
right now.
I saw you, lyrics started already. No, not yet.
NeurIPS will start soon.
Yes.
Today's
You
like the
have something,
first day.
right?
I have something. Yeah, my workshop is on the last day, and then tomorrow is the paper.
Good. Good. So, let's wait for some time.
How are you doing?
Yeah, fine. Yeah. I think we should talk some time again, maybe.
Yes.
Some of the works we are doing. So this work is based on your CVPR or
It's a combination, so it'll be ECCV,
okay.
NeurIPS, and CVPR.
I see. Yeah, because been working for this self-supervised.
It is
For a
work in
while.
progress as well. So that part I'm not talking about because
Okay.
it's like too soon. I didn't really have too much time to do it. This is
Yeah,
past CVPR, ECCV, and NeurIPS.
right. So we have recently started this series, like I think 4 or 5 talks,
Mhm.
broadly in computer science areas, like not just vision, but other, like for the department. Like monthly, twice, we do this type of things. More of the idea is to like get students like get interested in things. So yeah.
You started at IIT Jodhpur a couple of years ago? 2 years?
Now it's 1 year. Yeah, 1 point
1 year?
something. Yeah. So this Omkar is not in your team, right? It's different.
Omkar is in like a sister team, but yeah, not like this
Okay.
particular team. Yeah.
Not the same team. Yeah. And Praveen, you know, right?
Yeah. We
Praveen.
actually
Yeah.
spoke just this
Yeah.
Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So he is in the same, not same team.
So he comes under the Facebook AI umbrella, but he's in the
Right.
Facebook AI applied research umbrella, not the research umbrella.
Okay. Okay.
So he's still a part of Facebook AI, but
Yeah.
two sister teams in there. You remember Rohit Kirdar probably.
Yeah. Where
So
is
Rohit
he?
is in my team. Yeah,
He's
he's in
in
my team,
Facebook. Yeah.
exactly.
I think we met last year, right? Yeah, last ICCB was there, right? I guess.
Yes, ICCV was there.
Yeah.
Yes.
So here Yashasvi is also there. Yashasvi, you know, right?
Yashasvi is in Facebook?
Yashasvi was no here in Jodhpur, IT Jodhpur.
Okay, I see. Oh, I
Yashasvi
remember him.
Verma.
Yes. Yeah, I see. I see.
Yeah, yes, he also is.
Just keeps moving.
Two, 3 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Huh? So, Pallavi, we can start meeting.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah. All right. So, good evening and good morning to Ishan. So, we have a speaker, Ishan Misra, who is research scientist at Facebook AI Research, where he works on computer vision and machine learning. His interest is in reducing the need for supervision in visual learning. Dr. Ishan finished his PhD at Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon, and he received SCS Distinguished Dissertation Award runner-up in 2018 for his PhD thesis. And I personally know him for a long time now, and especially I remember when I was TA for computer vision course, and Ishan was a student. And that time, in particular, one project was in my mind when there was an image retrieval project, and the science has done exceptionally well in that. And it was like it was a demo which I remember particularly, and I was having some hard examples prepared, but they were doing very well. Yeah. So with that, I will hand it over to Ishan. is Ishan. Please.
Thank you so much. Yes, I remember that demo as well. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So hi everyone. My name's Ishan. So today I'll talk about multi-view invariance and grouping for self-supervised learning. And so one of the success stories for computer vision has really been this sort of story of pre-training, where I think one of the main reasons why we've had such a boom of computer vision and like such successful applications is really that ImageNet pre-trained features work really well for downstream tasks. So it's we could take images from ImageNet, we can learn a representation, and that representation is learned by basically trying to classify images into like a bunch of categories. So ImageNet has a predefined set of categories. But it's not that ImageNet covers the full world. So ImageNet still has like only a subset of categories. The reason this was a groundbreaking moment for computer vision is because the features that we learn from this step actually end up generalizing to other downstream tasks. So you can take this connet that was actually learned on ImageNet, and that connet will end up being really useful and will actually perform really well on other downstream tasks where you're trying to solve other classification or detection benchmarks. This would be sort of the main recipe where you pre-train your connet on a large supervised data set. And then you basically are able to now collect another new data of supervised images, which is the task that you actually care about. And then you train the connet on that downstream task. So there are basically two stages of training. The one is pre-training, which happens before your training. And then the second stage is training, where you're actually solving the task that you care about. And so for all of this, when you're actually doing this, there is another competing paradigm, which is basically not about using supervised pre-training. The idea is to use an alternative supervision. And the main reason for this is that getting real labels is really difficult and expensive. So when you're doing the supervised pre-training step on ImageNet, ImageNet has, like the full ImageNet dataset has 14 million images, and it took about 22 human years to label it properly. And there are many other ways of obtaining supervision. For example, you can just use hashtags or tags associated with images which are uploaded to the internet. You can use GPS locations. And the focus of this talk is on the third aspect, which is using the data itself, self-supervised or unsupervised learning. So why do we even go through all of this? Let's just try to start with a simple thought exercise, which is, can we get labels for all the data that we have? So if we talk about like images and we try to get bounding boxes for these images, so this kind of supervision is quite expensive to get, because what we really want is what concepts are present in the image. And for each of these concepts, we want a box telling us where the concept is located. So it's a 4-corner box. And if we sort of take all the data sets that we have in computer vision that have bounding box annotations, then we see that we get about 1 million or so such images. Now, if we relax this constraint and we say that we don't really care about bounding box annotations, we only care about what concepts are present in the image, not where they're located, then we can basically get an order of magnitude more data. So we get like 14 million images or so. Now, if you sort of look at the comparison of what internet photos are more than 1 trillion photos available on the internet. And it's not that there is an error on this graph. It's just that when I plot the internet images, there is no way of seeing bounding boxes or image level. So we just need to move to log scale. And log scale, you basically see that there's a difference of about 6 orders of magnitude or 7 orders of magnitude to what internet photos are and to what we have labeled. So it's really, really hard for us to label all internet photos. And now internet photos themselves are not really representative of what the real world is. So the real world, we have lots of data. It's not just limited to photos, it has audio components, it has video components, there is text. And so it's really not going to be possible for us to get labels for all data. And again, as a reminder, ImageNet, which was just 14 million images, required 22 human years to label, and it only has 22,000 concepts. So it's not even that many concepts. And really, labeling just does not scale. Labeling does not scale to the size of data we generate, and it's going to be harder as we move forward to get labels for all our data. The other problem with getting labels is that there are lots of rare concepts which occupy a long tail of the images. So if you look at the kind of labels that we have on most standard data sets, 10% of the classes occupy 93% of the data. So for a lot of classes, we just don't end up getting enough amount of data. It's a big long tail distribution. And finally, for other domains, for example, medical images, ImageNet pre-training may not work because when you're trying to do the supervised pre-training, it does not generalize to the downstream task. So what is self-supervision? Self-supervision is a process where you obtain labels by using a semi-automatic process. So one standard example is that you have observed data and you hidden data. And just using the observed data, you try to predict some property of the data, of the hidden data. So one of the sort of oldest examples of this, and this goes back to Virginia Desai's 94 thesis, where she coined this term self-supervised learning, was that there are three sort of distinct modes of supervised, unsupervised, and self-supervised learning. So supervised is where you basically have an input and you have a target. So in this case, input is the image of a cow and the target is the label cow. You just have the image cow. And self-supervised, say you had what kind of sound a cow makes. So you had the audio of it. So in this way, what you can do is you can set up a prediction problem where you try to predict the audio of what a cow is saying from the visual input. And so it's not that someone has provided you with labels. It's just the fact that you're taking some part of the data, which is audio, you're hiding it. And then you're taking the observed part of the data, which is images, and you're predicting the hidden part from the observed part. And yes, there is a lot of line of work trying to do something in weak supervision as well, but this is really not going to be the main focus of this talk. So let's start with something like computer vision, where pretext tasks have really sort of dominated computer vision. So I'm just going to skip these slides because I believe there's some issue. Yes. Okay. Sorry. Very sorry. Okay. Some slides seem to be out of order. So pretext tasks have generally been fairly successful for computer vision, where the idea has been that you create a proxy task, the task that you're not really interested in solving, and you solve that task in order to pre-train your network. For example, you can take something like rotation, where you take an image, you rotate it randomly by a particular set of angles, and then you ask a network to take this rotated image and predict what the rotation angle is. So you can rotate the image by, say, 90 degrees. And now you take that rotated image into a network, and the network is solving a four-way classification problem, where it's trying to predict which rotation was applied to the input. Another sort of standard example is asking a network to solve jigsaw puzzles. So you take an image, you break it into 3x3 patches, you get like 9 patches, you randomly permute them, and then you input them to a network which is tasked with sort of solving this jigsaw puzzle. So it's trying to predict how did you sort of shuffle these input patches. So why should any of these sort of methods really teach you anything about computer vision? So why should predicting rotation of an image really teach you anything? So there's no concrete explanation for this. A lot of it has to do with intuition, and a lot of it is really just design. So for example, when you're trying to predict the rotation of an object, a rotation of an image, there is some notion that the network needs to recognize what the objects in the image are. So it really needs to understand that sky will always occur on top of sand, or like on top of water, or like trees have to be upright. So generally the green portion or leaves of a tree is going to be above, say, the bark of a tree. So there's some sort of notion of weak semantics that pops up when you're trying to solve these kind of rotation tasks. But in general, we really don't know how this is working. So I would say a lot of it is just wishful thinking. We have a pre-training, which is weak or self-supervised. We have a bunch of transfer tasks. And we really wish hard that our pre-training ends up helping us on these downstream transfer tasks. And so there's a big sort of misalignment problem. In the pre-training part, we are solving jigsaw puzzles. But really, solving jigsaw puzzles is not interesting from any practical perspective. In the transfer tasks, we're using this network to do something which is more sort of practical. For example, trying to classify whether this image has dogs or trying to classify whether what sort of categories are present in the image, or something like image captioning. So there's sort of this very big mismatch between this pre-training step and the transfer test. And a lot of the success of pre-training in computer vision pre-2019 was really based on wishful thinking. So on the other hand, if you look at NLP, there have been really sort of successful applications of self-supervised learning. So BERT, Word2Vec, Roberta, all of these are sort of very standard things by now. And you take these models, you learn them on like lots of web data, GPT-3, and then you end up getting fairly powerful models. So in this talk, I'm really going to talk about self-supervised learning in the context of computer vision. So the two things that I'm going to talk about are multi-view and grouping. So, and I'm going to sort of try to convince you by the end of this talk that both of these are sort of really important properties of any representation that we want to learn for computer vision. So multi-view is looking at the same data sample, but in different ways. For example, like the sort of naivest way to think about it is in terms of geometry. So you have a single input and you're looking at it like from basically two different camera viewpoints. Way, multi-view can also be about looking at the same sample, but in different modalities. For example, the initial example that I gave of a cow and its audio. So the visual input is one view of the data, and the audio input is another view of the data. So you end up getting two of these different views. And what I'm going to try to say is these sort of multiple views are very helpful, especially when you're trying to learn these semantic representations in an unsupervised way. And the second part is grouping, which is really about associating related samples. So a feature representation should really is only sort of useful if it can tell you that this particular glass of wine is also similar to this other glass of wine, and both of these are actually the same concepts. And so for another example of this is basically, say, looking at a tree. So multi-view invariance tells you that basically it's the same tree, and it's the same tree no matter whether it's day or night, whether the sky was less cloudy or more cloudy, or whether it's winter or whether it's summer. And grouping tells you that all these sort of four pictures, no matter the fact that the color of the leaves is slightly different, or the shape of the leaves is slightly different, or where the tree is located is slightly different, all four of these pictures actually contain the same concept. So throughout this talk, I'm really going to try to fill this table, which is going to be basically studying a method that we have in self-supervised learning and trying to figure out whether it has this property of multi-view invariance and grouping. So let's start with basically the same pretext tasks that I was talking about earlier. So the idea here is that we want to create these proxy or pretext tasks. These tasks really themselves are not useful. It's just that they're going to be useful for pre-training. And like I've mentioned earlier, there is really no reason to believe that they're actually going to help us for transfer tasks. It's a lot of wishful thinking. So one of the first pretext tasks, which was fairly successful in Vision, was this task of predicting relative position. So the idea is that you take two patches in an input image. And so say you take a patch on the face of this cat and another patch on the ear of the cat. And then you basically feed forward these patches through a network, and you classify what is the relative location of one of the patches with respect to the second patch. So as the diagram showing, there are basically 8 possible locations. If you take a blue patch, which is say centered on the face of a cat, and then you can sample a red patch, which is going to be basically along any of the 8 possible locations. So this network is just going to solve a 8-way classification problem. And it's the idea is that basically by solving this classification problem, the network learns some useful features. And it does end up learning something fairly surprisingly useful. So in this diagram, what I'm showing is on the left-hand side, you have an input patch. And you have now 3 different types of networks. So you have a relative position network. That was a network learned by this sort of unsupervised method. In between, you have like a randomly initialized network. And on the right-hand side, you have a supervised network, which was, in this case, ImageNet AlexNet. And so what we're doing is we're taking the input patch, which is on the left-hand side. We're computing its features. And then we're retrieving the closest patches that we have in our training set to this patch based on the features from a network, and that network can be relative position, random initialization, or a supervised network. And so if you look at, say, something like the top row over here, what we see is when you have an input patch which contains a wheel, you end up getting these sort of relative positioning patches that you end up retrieving are actually all wheels. A randomly initialized model retrieves basically, it's all over the place. So it can retrieve like a potted plant, it can retrieve a human head, or even like a dog head. Whereas a supervised network actually ends up retrieving similarly, as expected, parts of a wheel. And so surprisingly, across all of these patches, you end up seeing that the relative positioning network, which was really not trained with any kind of supervision, all it was trying to do was take these two sort of patches and predict how they're located with respect to one another. It ends up learning something where the patches that it retrieves are generally very related to the input image. So there were lots of examples of these pretext tasks, the two that I've already mentioned, rotation and jigsaw puzzles. And for like the most part of time, so from like 2015 to 2019, a lot of the work in self-supervised learning for vision was really about designing these pretext tasks. So people would come up with their own intuitions on why they think a particular task is useful, train the network, lots of other design decisions. For example, what should be the scale of the patch, how many classes to classify into, what should be the distance between the two patches, and so on. And so the idea over here was basically that you would try to come up with these pretext tasks and basically hope that they end up generalizing. So now let's look at basically what a pretext task is in more of a sort of abstract manner. So in a pretext task, what ends up happening is you have an input image. You apply an image transform to the input image. So you have I, you apply a transform T, and you end up getting a transformed image IT. And the pretext task is really that you feed this image IT and you're asking the coordinate to predict a property of the transform T. For example, what was the rotation that I applied to it? Or how many patches are there? And so basically, if my image transform was basically shuffling the patches, then I'm trying to predict how did I shuffle them, or basically what a jigsaw puzzle is. And so what ends up happening is basically that you have this image T going through multiple layers of a ConvNet. And at the last layer, you're predicting some sort of image information about the transform T. And so essentially, what you're doing is the last layer features should contain some information about the input transform T itself. Unfortunately, what this ends up doing is the features learned by most of these pretext tasks are actually fairly less semantic. And the reason for this is if you're rotating an input image, if you think about it, at the last layer, you don't really want the feature to change very abruptly when the input is rotated. And so one of the sort of standard things in computer vision is invariance, where no matter what happens to the input, so when you apply like random perturbations, like slightly jitter the data, slightly jitter the color of the image, you don't want the final layer feature representation to change by that much. Because with slight amount of lighting changes or slight amount of color changes, the semantic content of the image does not change. And the last layer features are supposed to be more semantic because they're supposed to help you understand what sort of semantic concepts are present in the image. But in the pretext task, we're doing something exactly the opposite. What we're doing is we're transforming or perturbing the input image with a transform T. And at the last layer, we're really expecting the feature to carry that low-level information with it. And so there were multiple experiments done to basically sort of figure this out. So in this graph, what I'm showing is the different layers of a ResNet. So starting with Con1, Res2, Res3, Res4, Res5, which is basically getting deeper. So if you go back to this sort of figure, it's basically getting more and more deeper. So Con1 would be the layer that is closest to the input, and Res5 is the layer that's closest to the output. And so if you look at the performance of the features, you basically see that from Con1 to Res4, the performance greatly increases, which is kind of expected because you're getting more and more abstract. But suddenly there's a big drop when you go from Res4 to Res5. And in this case, I'm showing like it for Jigsaw and Rotnet. And you immediately sort of notice that this drop is probably mostly because The res5 feature really contains very low level information, so it's not going to be very semantic. So if you look at the pretext task, it really does not have this notion of multi-view invariance. In fact, it's actually in some way covariant to the input. If you change t, the feature should actually change according to the input t, the transform t. Now let's look at whether it has this property of grouping. So a pretext task only operates on the image I, and the prediction that it makes is only about the image I and the transform t. So really, it does not, by its setup or its loss function, it's really not making any predictions about a group or collection of images. We are kind of hoping that this sort of grouping property emerges, but nothing in the loss function really explicitly enforces it. So in reality, there is no relation to other images. So we can sort of fill this into our table. So multi-view invariance, no, grouping, no, and the performance is really kind of weak. And so up until 2019, for vision at least, a lot of people had this sort of quote where self-supervised learning was thought to be of a very sort of naive or optimistic hope for feature learning. A lot of people really believed it would not work. But in the past couple of years, that has really sort of changed. Multiple people have really shown that self-supervised learning can be very useful. So in that spirit, we had this paper called Pearl, the first to really show that self-supervised learning can be extremely powerful tool for training visual recognition models. And this was also one of the first works to really outperform supervised pre-training for tasks like object detection. So the key idea of Perl was basically try to be invariant to the pretext transform. So when I was filling out that table, I told you that pretext transforms basically have this missing notion of multi-view invariance. So let's try to add that invariance back. So what ends up happening in this case is you have an image I, which is the original image. You have the transformed version IT. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to learn a feature representation that is robust or sort of invariant to this transform T. So the features that you end up getting from I and IT should basically be very similar. This is in stark contrast to basically if you think about pretext tasks, because in pretext tasks, this would really not happen because at the last layer, you want to figure out what exactly T is. And in this case, the loss function itself has nothing to do with the transform T. So we end up sort of learning this invariance by using contrastive learning. Contrastive learning is a fairly straightforward way of saying that the feature V coming from the image I or the feature V coming from the transformed version VIT should both be the same. And essentially, this sort of loss function encourages explicitly invariance to data augmentations and multiple views created by the pretext task. So when I introduced this notion of views, I said that there is, of course, the simple geometric notion where you can look at a sample like from different viewpoints in 3D. But what I mean over here is something more nuanced, where the image I and image IT are basic, or the transformed version are essentially the same views or same way of looking at, are different ways of looking at the same exact input data. So just the sort of one slide summary of contrastive learning. Contrastive learning is basically just about learning representations for samples that are related and unrelated. So what it tries to do is you have a set of concepts that are going to be related and unrelated images. You have a network that computes their feature embeddings. And now you impose a loss function, which is going to try to bring together the embeddings or the features from two related concepts close by and push away the embeddings or features from unrelated concepts far away. So on the right-hand side, what it's really trying to do is the distance between the related features should be smaller than the distance between the unrelated features. So in the sort of feature space, it's really trying to cluster together or move the related embeddings together and push away all the unrelated embeddings. So in Perl, the sort of we can use contrastive learning fairly simply. What we're really trying to do is trying to pull together the features from the image and the patch and basically push away the features from random images. So you take an image I and you have a bunch of other random images in the data set, and you basically just push them away. So like I mentioned earlier, you take this sort of Perl task, you pre-train your network, and then you can take this pre-trained network and fine-tune it on a task like object detection. You can do, of course, the same thing with an ImageNet supervised network, which takes an ImageNet. You basically first do the simple supervised classification task, and then take the ImageNet network and do object detection. So what ends up happening fairly surprisingly is that you get this Perl method, which does not even look at labels, ends up learning a fairly powerful pre-trained network. So on tasks like detection, for like on this data set VOC 0712, we see a fairly considerable gain in performance compared to an ImageNet supervised network. And prior to this work, it was considered kind of an impossible task to achieve. That ImageNet supervised was really the upper bound. And since this work, there have been like lots of other works which have shown this particular way, that self-supervised pretraining for object detection actually performs much, much better than ImageNet supervised pretraining. And now this gap is really increasing. So in some ways, self-supervised pretraining has really enabled more and more accurate object detection models since 2019. On tasks, so compared to, say, ImageNet supervised training on a task like image classification, we can see that Perl kind of performs better than, at that point, the sort of closest methods possible. But there was still a fairly large gap. So if you look at the supervised number is basically somewhere around 76, and what Perl was getting at that time was 63. And so I'll talk about why this is the case in a bit. But how about the sort of that we were trying to address, that there is lack of invariance in something like Jigsaw, whereas Perl is not really doing that. So remember earlier I'd shown you this graph where if you look at Jigsaw and the performance sort of really goes up from Con1 to Res4, but then there's a drop from Res4 to Res5. Compared to that, for Perl, we basically see that the feature becomes increasingly more semantic or more transferable as you sort of go deeper into the network. So this sort of says that adding this property of invariance really is more useful and can sort of lead to better and more semantic features. So coming back to the table. So if you look at Perl, it explicitly has this notion of multi-view invariance because you're taking the image and patches as different views and you're forcing them to sort of have the same features. The concept of grouping really is very limited because the only way we sort of in our loss function relate to other images is by using them as negatives in contrastive learning. The performance is moderate because on certain tasks, we are actually able to beat, say, supervised learning. But on certain other tasks like image classification, there's a fairly large sort of gap in performance. And so most of this sort of lack of grouping really comes from the fact that we're using this instance-based contrastive learning method, where the positive is the same image. It's just views of it created with different data augmentation. And the negatives are basically images in the data set, but like different images. And so this framework of instance-based contrastive learning has really powered most of the recent breakthroughs in computer vision. So if you look at methods like CPC, MoCo, BaoNet, all of them have some notion of instance-based contrastive learning happening in the background. So SimCLR, everything sort of has, it's going to be this particular slide. It's just the fact that the views are being created slightly differently. And so the problem with, of course, instance-based discrimination is that on the positive side, you have no notion of groups. And on the negative side, you have this notion of groups, but it's kind of really weak because you're relating the images just by sort of in a different instances. So I'm going to talk about two ways of adding grouping to contrastive learning. And one of them is basically going to add grouping to audio and video, and the other one is going to add grouping to images. And so the audio video work is called AVID, and the image work is SWAV, which will be presented at NeurIPS tomorrow. So AVID was this work done by Pedro Murgado from University of California, San Diego. Really awesome guy. And we had a lot of fun doing this project. So the first thing we wanted to basically look at in when we're trying to learn these representations is look at audio and video space, where there had been a lot of fairly interesting work. So the main source of signal in audio-visual learning is audio-visual correspondence, where you have, say, two videos and you have the corresponding audio of these videos. You can take the video and the audio, and which basically are sort of related, and you can take video and audio which are unrelated, and that basically becomes a negative sample. So the other task in this case is also audio-visual synchronization, where you can take the image, basically take the audio, and you can take the video at that particular time step, and that basically becomes a positive. And then you can basically also end up taking, yeah, you can also end up taking basically the video and audio at another time step, and that basically ends up becoming its negative. So if you look at this audio-visual synchronization method, its biggest problem is the fact that it has this notion of multivariance, because it is really relating the video input and the audio input, but there is no notion of grouping because it's really just talking about a single instance at a time. And the performance of these methods was fairly weak at the time. So the first thing we did was fairly similar to Perl. We tried to basically just see if we can introduce this notion of instance discrimination or contrastive learning to make the features better. So in this case, the positives are basically the audio and the video. So it's the same sample, it's just two different views of it. And the negatives are basically going to be similar to Perl, where you basically have just the samples in the other samples, and those are going to be treated as negatives. So this, and we've mentioned this before as well, there is very limited grouping in this particular scenario because the audio and the video are coming from the same sample. So the first thing to check out was, how do you sort of, is multi-view even important when you're trying to do this contrastive learning or trying to learn features? So we could have three different variants when we were trying to do this contrastive learning, where we first can do this contrastive learning on the video separately and the audio separately. So there is no relation between the two. You can do contrastive learning where you're just trying to predict the audio feature from the video feature and vice versa. And you can do a combination of these losses where you can basically do contrastive learning on the video features independently, the audio features independently, and a cross-modal loss separately. What ends up being really surprising is that just the multi-view part, which does audio-video prediction and video-audio prediction, is surprisingly much, much, much better than both of these versions. So the audio-video representation ends up outperforming the video-only representations. So if you look at the performance compared to, say, other work, so most of this work is like on this particular slide is really trying to do either the audio-visual correspondence problem, which has no notion of multivariance, or is just trying to do visual-only self-supervised learning. And compared to that, Avid is doing particularly well on, especially like given that our model is much smaller and we are still able to get much higher accuracy. So Avid does have this notion of multi-view invariance, yes, but similar to Perl, it has this notion, it has this weakness that there is really no grouping. The performance is good, but still it can be improved much more. So the second step that we did to introduce grouping was try to use audio-visual agreements. So in this case, the idea was that you can take a sample, which is a reference sample on the top right side, the star over here. And you can compute similarity of all the samples in the data set using either the audio features or the video features. And what ends up happening is if you look at samples that are similar to a particular, which are similar in basically both the audio space and the video space, these samples are very likely to be related or semantically related to the reference sample. Whereas samples that are either dissimilar in both spaces or dissimilar in only just one space are going to be negatives. So in this case, what we've done is we've taken the contrastive learning term and we've just expanded the notion of positives. Whereas earlier it was just going to treat the same sample, just audio features or video features as basically positives. Now it has this entire big sort of the part of the graph highlighted in blue that it can treat as positives. So we've explicitly introduced this notion of grouping because for this yellow sample, all of these samples are going to be positives, whereas all of the red samples are going to be negatives. So there are two large groups of positives and negatives created for every sample. So let's look at a few examples of what these audiovisual agreements look like. So on the top row, I'm showing you the reference sample, which is the yellow sample. And then you have these positives and the visual negatives and the audio negatives. So if you look at the positives for all three examples, they seem to be, if you look at the semantic category that they belong to, all positives actually end up belonging to the same semantic category. If you look at the visual negatives, they are similar in the visual domain to the input, but they're very different in terms of audio. For example, if you look at the middle column, where the reference sample is of a person playing violin, the person playing a guitar, uh, if you don't hear the audio, these two, it's basically just someone playing musical instruments. But in the audio space, a violin and a guitar sound very, very different. So what ends up being the case is that you can very easily figure out that these two samples are not related if you look at their audio. Similarly, if you look at the audio negatives, so what ends up happening is basically that for something like a moving train, which creates a lot of noise, the audio is particularly informative because it's just going to be a bunch of rattling on train tracks. And something like a moving boat is also creating a lot of high frequency noise. So in the audio space, these examples are related. But in the visual space, it's very easy to figure out that one is basically a train and the other is just a mass of water. So it's very easy to sort of separate them out. What we end up doing finally is that we end up sort of training Avid with these positive and negative groups of samples. And we observed that basically Avid combined with this cross-modal agreement ends up performing even better. And at that time was sort of state-of-the-art method around ECCP. So we looked at like three particular methods in this case: AV sync, which was the initial way of training networks, where it did not have grouping and the performance was kind of weak. Contrastive learning, where the grouping was kind of there, but not really. Performance was good. And then CMA, which basically introduces both invariance and grouping, and the performance is much better. So let's move on to the second case, which is basically adding grouping to images. And this work is called SWAV, which stands for Swapping Assignments Between Views. And it's a paper at this year's NeurIPS. So the one thing that we sort of wanted to introduce for grouping in this work was try to create explicit groups. So if you have a data set which contains a bunch of samples, and you have a series of prototypes, which basically can be considered as groups or vectors corresponding to groups. What we're going to basically do in this work is trying to take every sample in the data set, and we're going to measure its similarity to the prototypes. So if two samples basically end up saying that, so the way it sort of introduces grouping is that when you take a sample and you consider its similarity to a bunch of prototypes, if two samples have the same kind of similarity or are similar to the same prototype, then you consider them to be as a group. So it's introducing the similarity through the way of similarity and grouping through the way of using these prototypes. So for example, what you can do is you can take all your data set and you can compute its similarity to each particular prototype. And you get this sort of soft vector, which is a vector of similarities to each prototype. And we consider these vectors to be kind of codes. So for each of these samples, if you have k prototypes, you'll get a k length code. And the code basically contains how similar each sample is to a prototype. And the notion of multi-view in SWAV basically comes from comparing different crops or comparing different crops which are going to have different sizes and resolutions. So this is fairly similar to Perl. What you do is you take an image, you compute two particular crops of it, which is going to be, say, in this particular case, a red crop, which is a larger crop and a higher resolution crop. And then you have another green crop, which is going to be a smaller crop. So what we do is we feed forward both of these crops through a network. We get a feature embedding, and we compute a code for each of the feature embeddings by computing their similarity to the prototypes. So you get like the scale length code. But then what we end up doing is we end up basically setting up a swapped prediction problem where the code that we obtain from the top sort of high resolution crop needs to be predicted from the crop that is the low resolution crop. And then vice versa. The crop from the high resolution basically ends up predicting the code from the lower resolution. You end up getting a sort of backpropagation gradient. You end up training the network. And what is more important is basically that the prototypes themselves are actually also backpropped. So the prototypes are also learned in a sort of end-to-end manner when you're training this network. And more importantly, I would say this method is not contrastive at all because it's really just setting up this. It does 2 forward passes. There is no notion of negatives. You're just predicting the swapped codes, and then you just backprop and get a gradient. So the multi-view notion of the method is fairly important because we did this analysis where we added multi-view invariance to the state-of-the-art methods like SimCLR, Sela, and Deep Cluster. And for every single method, we were actually able to see a fairly large increase in performance on ImageNet. So at least a 2% to 4% increase in top one accuracy. And the other advantage of SOAV was basically that on all the transfer tasks that we considered except ImageNet, it was able to outperform not only like prior self-supervised work, but also supervised ImageNet pre-training. So for example, on object detection, as I've shown you earlier, there were quite a few methods that could do this, but SWAV was still state of the art. And on other tasks of like linear classification, we basically, for example, an ImageNet would get only like 53% on places. SWAV was considerably better at 56. The other thing was it was fairly close in top one accuracy on ImageNet itself. So a supervised network gets something like 76.5. We were getting 75.3. And again, SWAV is not using any labels. So this is still a pretty good achievement. Apart from all of this, there were a few other practical advantages of SWAV, which is that it, compared to other work, it actually trained on a sort of smaller number of GPUs and had faster convergence. So with just the sort of smaller amount of compute requirements, you could get better results. And there are code and models that we released. There's a PyTorch Lightning implementation as well. So compared to like, now let's just go back to the table. Compared to the pretext tasks, which had grouping or no invariance, and compared to something like Perl or most contrastive methods, which had very weak grouping, SWAV explicitly has both of these concepts. So it has both multi-view invariance and grouping, and the performance is actually better. And it can outperform ImageNet supervised pre-training on all the transfer tasks that we considered in the paper. So what's next? Like, have we solved self-supervised learning, or are there sort of other things to do? And I think there's sort of a very large open space of analysis, not really just about developing new methods. It's still not clear to us what invariances really matter. So the set of invariances, something like multi-crop or something introduced in other works, is really overfit to the ImageNet dataset. So we use something like horizontal flipping, which we consider to be like serially good in ImageNet. It really may not be a good idea for a lot of tasks. And so I think a lot of analysis in this space really needs to focus on different image distributions, uncurated data, or data that is really not ImageNet. Because if you just keep analyzing on ImageNet, we are kind of overfit to the image distribution that ImageNet has, which is fairly peculiar. And the second thing is really scalable objectives. The grouping notion itself is fairly important, and probably introducing it in some way or the other is going to be more useful. Contrastive learning by itself is converging fairly slowly, so maybe designing better objectives that converge better and converge faster is a good idea. Probably you're going to be the next folks to design this, which is where you have maybe another property, because this table by itself was not exhaustive. There's probably another property that really needs to come in. That's it from my side. Thanks.
Thanks, Ishan. So yeah, I think you can ask questions, participants on chat, or you can unmute and ask. Yeah, but I have one question. So I could not understand that prototype part, like in your NeurIPS work.
Right.
I
uh,
was somewhere that part.
let me just see
Go
if I
to
can
slide.
quickly go to that one. Right. So the idea is basically say you have these k centroids. So suppose you were doing k-means. Okay. Suppose what you can do is you can take your feature representation, you can cluster it, and you get the centroids from the feature representations, and you can think of them as to be prototypes.
And this is fully like there is no supervision, right?
There is no supervision at all.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So this is just
if you take the
okay. And how do you like? And you play with number of different prototypes, or
yes,
like?
so I mean, roughly it turns out to be not super sensitive to the number of prototypes. If you start with something like 1,000, 3,000, it's roughly the same.
Okay.
And
So
so
this
there
is
was
just
a
a
prior work to
clustering
this
kind of.
where the prototypes were initialized by k-means. So
Mhm.
you would do k-means, you would initialize the prototypes. But basically, we finally figured out that you don't even need to do that. The prototypes can be randomly initialized. And if you learn them through back propagation, you're actually able to sort of cluster the data simultaneously while you're doing representation learning.
And you somewhere you said that you also learn this prototype by backpropagating.
Yes,
Like,
yes,
can
yes.
you explain that a
This
bit?
one, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, so because the codes that you're computing over here are really computed with a dot product with the prototypes, you can actually get a gradient back into the prototypes themselves. So this SWAV method can be interpreted as an online clustering method. So what you're doing is you're taking that input and you're basically computing these online cluster centers, which are prototypes, and you're learning them by basically just simple backpropagation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Atul, you have any question? Hi. Yeah. Please ask if you have. You can unmute or you can type. No. Okay. Anyone have any question? How was the number? No, I think this already answered. Right, San, Revan,
Yeah. So I mean,
or the
the
number of
number of
clusters.
clusters we kind of decided based on like I would say it was kind of guesswork really. So for ImageNet, like something like 3,000 worked, although there are 1,000 underlying categories. For other data sets that we've tried it on, we just like pick a fairly large number generally because you really wanted to cluster, like you don't want it to just collapse all the concepts into like smaller number of clusters. You want the number of clusters to be high. So when we've tried it out on like other data sets where we really don't know, which are like unsupervised data sets where we don't really know the number of semantic concepts, we just set it to a fairly high number. Okay. Prototype backprop. Yeah. So okay, so the prototype is like a c-dimensional feature vector. Like it's a c-dimensional vector. Your feature is also a c-dimensional vector. So what you end up doing is basically the prototype and the feature are you compute a dot product using them. You get a similarity, and then after that we basically do something like optimal transport, which is a algorithm that basically just tries to normalize the scores. So say you have B samples in your batch and you have K prototypes. If you compute the similarity of these features to all the prototypes, you'll get a B times K matrix of similarities. Then what you do is you do a softmax on the columns and then a softmax on the rows. So it's just a two simple softmax. And then you get for each of the samples, you basically still have a K-dimensional code. That basically just becomes your simple K-dimensional code. You end up like basically just doing a sort of you take this as a target, you do the soft prediction problem. But basically, the point is that the code was computed using just in a product or a dot product similarity, and you can get a gradient back to it. You can get a gradient back to the prototypes using just the similarity.
What kind of loss functions are used? This is for this part.
So for like the SWAV method, it's just simple softmax cross entropy. So the codes themselves are k-dimensional targets, and you just use softmax cross entropy to minimize the loss. The cropping
Okay.
done in
Swap is
SWAV
done
is
randomly
randomly.
or by
Yes, it is random.
identifying. It is random, yeah.
It's random.
Yeah. Okay. And so you are also doing some more vision and language type tasks other than
Not so much anymore.
in
I
the
would say
self-supervised.
I'm fairly much into self-supervised these days. So last year it
Yeah.
was a little bit of vision language, but more and more these days it's, I would say, more self-supervised.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, really nice talk. So I think we don't have more questions, perhaps. Okay, the work is amazing. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So yeah, so thanks, Vibhav. Yeah, let's catch up again maybe sometime. More interaction.
Thank you so much, Ishan.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thanks to
Ishan.
all the participants. See you all next Monday. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.